Hello and welcome. You are listening to the Boardroom Agenda, frankly speaking podcast brought to you by BDO South Africa. Boardroom Agenda is a collection of conversations facilitated by BDO with those charged with governance, as well as subject matter experts on wide-ranging themes and topics, all guided by the non-executive director's agenda. I am Ricardo, BDO South Africa non-executive director, hub leader, and your host for the Boardroom Agenda. Thank you for joining the conversation. The sustainability agenda incorporates the three dimensions of environment, social, and governance, all three factors which address a corporate's ability to meet its own needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The recent United Nations Climate Change Conference, commonly referred to as COP26, once again brought the sustainability agenda into the global and corporate headlines with the focus on climate-related issues. It's a fact that the environmental and governance pillars of ESG receive a lot of attention and are easily relatable to business. The social dimension of ESG, which extends to include supply chain accountability, human rights, and fair labor standards, are less extensively addressed in broader public forums. As a result, the social dimension is often considered as having a less tangible impact on the business bottom line and is at risk of not being addressed as a real business issue. It's also a dimension that is most difficult to unpack and contextualize in a business narrative and onto the boardroom agenda. In this conversation, we aim to highlight the business relevance of the S in ESG, dealing with the risks and the opportunities that the social dimension of sustainability brings to the agenda. Today, we are joined by Geralda Wildschutt, an experienced non-executive director and CEO of Maisha Social Solutions, where she specializes in ESG consulting, including CSR strategies, as well as risk and impact assessment for the mining and energy sectors. Karien Erasmus is a senior manager of BDO South Africa Risk and Advisory Services and is a specialist lead on BDO South Africa's sustainability reporting and advisory team. Hello, Geralda and Karien. Thank you for joining the conversation and unpacking the S in ESG. Let's kick off the conversation by reflecting on the just energy transition. I think it's clear that the adoption of the just energy transition brings into focus the need for an energy system which is better for people and for the planet. Geralda, as a non-executive director, what do you see as the key social issues of the just energy transition, particularly in the African context?
Ricardo, I think the S, which for many people in the mining industry, I think stands for social performance. And also all those things I think that intersects of the social performance with environment and with governance. And so I think what's important in the just transition is that it brings into scope all of those elements that doesn't focus, I think, on the more technical elements of how we move, to a green economy, but the just transition helps us to focus on things like the human rights agenda, looking at the workforce, at lives and livelihoods. So I think those are the important elements that the just transition brings to the table.
Thank you, Geralda, for putting that into context. And I think it's quite right, is that it's those two elements, if I can just play it back, of social performance, the focus on human rights agenda, as well as lives and the livelihoods. Karien, if you can come in here, as an advisor to boards, what are the other social issues that you would want to highlight, or possibly risks that come to mind when reflecting on Geralda's position around the key social issues of the just energy transition?
Thanks, Ricardo, and just thanks for this opportunity. I think Geralda's touched on a number of the key issues that one would see. to me personally, and what we've been discussing with clients or so in the past, is it relates to three specific aspects. The one
Right.
is in terms of if we look at social performance, for instance, touching on that, one of the key aspects that I would like to see come to the fore much more strongly in the discussion around the just energy transition, is the issue around education. We talk about skills transfer, we talk about skills diversification as a way in which to manage some of the social risks of the just energy transition. However, we don't talk about the foundational building blocks that we will need to achieve that transition, that skills transition. And here I'm talking about literacy, I'm talking about access to education, I'm talking about STEM research to build this new skills base that we would need for the transition. The second aspect that I think is very important, and this is specifically looking at the African context, if one looks at, for instance, the human rights element, relates to health and bringing health much more to the fore as part of these energy transition discussions. I think South Africa is a prime example where we've recently had quite a few reports highlighting the health plight of communities within these areas that are going to be affected by the transition, Mpumalanga specifically, and this intersection between this transition, but also the need for health infrastructure and health services. And the third element, also linking back to livelihoods, to the human rights issue, is our opportunity here to plow back equity and equality into these communities. The creation of new value chains, the creation of sustainable secondary economies within these areas really allow for opportunities around equity. And I'm thinking specifically of vulnerable groups in these communities. I'm thinking specifically of women, for instance, and the ability to participate in what this new transition could enable.
Thank you, Karien. I think reflecting on both what Geralda and Karien you've shared with us, I think it's real to say that these are tangible issues from a business perspective. Geralda, could you come in here and explain and maybe share with us how you see the just energy transition specifically contributing to the broader human rights discussion in the African context, possibly extending it to mining, and what does this mean for the Boardroom Agenda?
Yes, Ricardo. So, I think a just transition is about human rights. And so all those things that Karien has also mentioned, I think are integral parts of the whole human rights agenda. So I do think as an example, some examples maybe to explain, for mining companies and all companies probably to understand specifically what are those negative impacts of the business activities on people. And so that could be, shared resources, for example, on water and energy, impacts on biodiversity, on cultural heritage, impacts for indigenous peoples, and on the social networks, that people form part of. So I think all of this is about human rights, the right to work, to a safe environment. Karien talked about health, of course, is in there, that when you look at your workforce, you've got to, of course, ensure the healthy return and safety of the workforce, and in understanding the interconnectedness of health between the workforce and the communities that the workforce, live and are part of. So the respect for or demonstrating as a company that you understand and can practice that respect for human rights, I think it's all part of this agenda of the just transition. And I think it needs to become an important part of how executive level employees and board level this understanding evolves. And if I say, often I think boards and maybe even at the exco level there is this assumption and talk around saying, well, human rights is the responsibility of governments. And so, why do we have to be involved in this conversation even? And I think it's bringing that understanding that the company and business has a responsibility to show respect for human rights. And this is, in the UN United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. And it's also coming out strongly in other international standards. So I do think as we talk about all these elements of how we transition, we've got to keep the human rights lens on all of this. And if I lastly say to some of the points Karien has made, if we understand that the whole move to net zero, as we are moving into a green economy, we're thinking of new technologies, new innovations, mechanization in mining, etc., that we should all do all of these things with a very keen focus on human rights and that impact that it may hold for our workforce and our communities.
Mm-hmm. And Geralda, are you seeing that narrative change at a board level?
I'm certainly, in the consulting work I do as well for mining companies, there are more work now or requests for work to do human rights due diligence.
Right.
I think this is now, again, if we look at accidents that's happened in terms of tailing dam failures, there are new standards like the global industry for tailing management that again focuses the attention on human rights as well as stakeholder engagement and disclosures to community. And so, yes, I think there is a keener understanding of this work. And I don't think we are there yet, but I think we're moving. And particularly you mentioned, we're within the African continent. I think, again, we've said we can't achieve this transition from high carbon to green economy in Africa without this very deep understanding about impacts, as we say, on lives, on livelihoods. So I do see it coming to the boardrooms. I do think it needs more attention, and I think new industry standards, for example, we're looking at the task force on climate disclosure, for example, that doesn't speak that clearly about human rights and about social implications. So I do think there's work to be done.
Thank you, Geralda.
Sure.
Karien, in your experience, what do you see as the key aspects of social impact and community involvement that are often, I suppose, left by the wayside when projects are being implemented? What's been your experience in that, Karien?
Thanks, Ricardo. I think if I may, just one point in terms of what you discussed earlier around the narrative and boardrooms leading into my answer. I think that mining will continue to play a very important role in our economy, certainly in the economies of many African countries, but also within the context of this transition. We need to mine the minerals to enable the technologies for a greener future at the end of the day. And I think the social license to operate, as Geralda has touched on, that's becoming something imperative to a number of boards in order to mitigate risk and in order to continue operations. Having said that, I think some of the aspects that are sometimes left at the wayside, as much as we, in some of the, specifically some of the climate risk work that I've done, as much as we we talk about concepts like Ubuntu or concepts like stakeholder engagement, which is robustly defined in our regulations, I don't think that is implemented in practice as effectively as it could be. So that initial startup discussions with communities and really entrenching that buy-in is really there. And without that foundation, there'll be cracks along the way, which erodes this cooperative relationship that could exist between, for instance, a mining company and its community. Having said that, however, some of the great examples that I've seen that have occurred is looking at, and this could definitely be extended, is with regards to long-term planning around secondary economy or long-term planning around community livelihoods once the mine moves into closure phases. There are some excellent examples, both in some of our African countries, but in South Africa as well, where companies have really taken up the challenge around using the rehabilitation process to create secondary economies for communities. And that kind of long-term planning is something that's not always there at the beginning. I think we're seeing a shift in the narrative around rehabilitation. We're moving away from rehabilitation being something that needs to happen once a mine closes into having rehabilitation discussions from a much earlier stage in the process. Looking at the new report that the around responsible mining, the effectiveness of these projects are specifically from a social or a human rights perspective. The effectiveness of these projects still need a lot of work. And I think that goes hand in hand with long-term planning. And it goes back again to that initial engagement with your community. Who are you dealing with? What are the long-term impacts that you need to plan for? What is the social infrastructure available to these communities to enable secondary economic activity? And so I think those three elements, initial entrenched engagement, long-term planning for social livelihoods, and linked to effectiveness parameters that are monitored and measured, would be what I would put on the table.
Thank you for summarizing that, Karien. I think that is quite useful, and again, like you said, needs to be more practically applied to make a change as opposed to just spoken about. Geralda, and what do you see? I mean, shifting the conversation to, I guess, the opportunities. What are the opportunities that are arising from this social dimension of ESG?
Ricardo, let me touch on where I think Karien took the conversation, because I think that these two questions are related. So I think where the opportunities lie and where we need to go are certainly the things that she has mentioned, and I also think then at a board level and at a leadership level to make sure that those practicalities happen. I think it's things like, yes, understanding the ethical conduct and practices of your business. So from a governance point of view, and I think if one then look at, if you are not acting in an ethical way, what is the price you pay in terms of reputation, financially and legally? In the same way we talked about, the negative social and human rights impacts on the workforce and communities. So again, if you look at what is the price you pay when there's opposition to the company or opposition to new mining projects that are much needed, as Karien has pointed out. And so that's the cost of conflict to the bottom line, and that's going to, take us back. And then I also think in terms of the environmental opportunities and issues. So how do we turn this into opportunity? So I think it's understanding these different and seeking knowledge within the company, of the integration and between these things of social performance elements of governance and the environmental agenda. And so again, maybe opportunities a bit more, I can say. I think it helps us then to think about, so how do we plan for the next 20, 30 years to do things right? And part of that has got to be the economic transformation of communities in Africa. As we started off saying, addressing these issues of entrenched poverty. And if we are going to transition and it leads to more job losses, then this picture just gets bleaker. And so we've got to think about with this long term, as Karien said rightly, think from the start about mine closure and that social transition plan within mine closure. And then think about the next 20, 30 years as the company plans their goals on transition, on how do we diversify local economies? How do we assist to look at opportunity within the next 30, 40 years in the supply chain of companies and its partner companies? So unlocking those sort of entrepreneurial opportunity, the new ones that will become available as we look at new technologies and new innovation. So we should all the time think very systemically about all of this, I would say.
I think that's a wonderful way to, wrap up the conversation, is really looking at those opportunities of making the long-term impact and the change that you've described and articulated. Thank you, Geralda. Maybe just in closing, both Geralda and Karien, from your own perspectives, as either an advisor to non-executives or as a non-executive yourself, what guidance would you give non-executives listening to the conversation to help them shape the social conversation around the ESG agenda at their boards? Karien, could I ask you to start?
Absolutely. Not to differ too much from what Geralda mentioned earlier around the TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That remains a mouthful. Recommendations. The International Sustainability Standards Board that was created last year, October, has recently come out with their first set of exposure drafts that they are looking at companies. And the objective with these frameworks really is to start to standardize and be able to compare sustainability and sustainability progress much more transparently across the board. And I've had a look at these drafts, and they do make use of the TCFD recommendations. However, they have used those within the greater sustainability context. And what they state is, because I agree with Geralda, absolutely, the initial TCFD recommendations doesn't really focus on human rights. It focuses on climate specifically. But what the incorporation of the 4 key elements of the recommendations, which is governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets, bring to the fore from a sustainability perspective, is a practical framework for companies to start to integrate sustainability across, and sustainability issues such as human rights, across these 4 components. And I think that's what we've been saying and we've been trying to convey all along, is that sustainability isn't something which is isolated and should be handled by one department and, be reported on in a singular report on an annual basis. It should be integrated. And the use of the structures of governance, the use of the planning around strategy, the use of your risk management system, and then obviously or then putting this into measurable targets through certain metrics, enables companies to start tracking and practically integrating some of these sustainability issues, human rights obviously being one of them, and being central to what the ISSB is trying to achieve at the end of the day.
Thank you, Karien, for bringing that into the conversation. Geralda, your closing thoughts and guidance for bringing the social agenda social dimension onto the agenda?
Thank you, Ricardo. I mean, so I'll summarize and say definitely it's seek the knowledge. So ESG, as we all know,
Right.
is a very fast changing discipline. And so I think boards and executives, leadership throughout the business should find and seek knowledge, make sure that you're staying up to speed with the changes in this world of sustainability and ESG. I think secondly, we've got to all ensure that this is part of the core strategy of the company and not an add-on. I think also there should be more awareness of moving away almost from an agenda that says, but we are providing money, the CSI focus on we're doing our part because we are giving CSI money and we are paying royalties, but rather think also about the negative impacts made, moving toward a just transition. So I would say also not just thinking as a company from a risk management perspective, but thinking about being part of the solution of leaving a lasting positive legacy for your company and your shareholders. And then lastly, I think, yes, the move away from a compliance-oriented way of doing work. I think all shareholders today and the younger population are all thinking about, being part of a solution for the future, for the planet. And so I would say to companies, that is where our focus should be. Thank you.
Lovely. Geralda and Karien, thank you. Thank you for making time to contribute to this conversation on the Boardroom Agenda. But most importantly, thank you for your clear insights and the perspectives on this social pillar. And it most certainly has highlighted the importance of the S in ESG. Thank you and goodbye. You have been listening to the Boardroom Agenda, a frankly speaking podcast brought to you by BDO South Africa.